So I wanted to let you guys in on a bit of a secret. This will shock you and surprise you, but I'm not actually perfect. I know you see me up here week after week, this specimen of humanity that I am, and the thought that I'm not perfect must be hard to believe. Sorry, I had to practice to even get that out, sorry. Because certainly, if you ask Bonnie, Bonnie will definitely verify that I'm not perfect. And she loves me anyway. Next, you jumped ahead on the points now, though. See? Yeah. She's getting ahead of the sermon now is what's happening. So clearly I'm not perfect, nor is iPad, in spite of what Apple tells you, by the way. Right? But the point I want to make there is that although we're all in relationships, right, and that when we're in our relationships, the way we see ourselves impacts how we behave in those relationships, right? Because we all have relationships. We have spouse relationships, we have relationships with our children, relationships with our parents, relationships with other people. And the thing is that if any of us walks into a relationship convinced that we have no problems, and convinced that we are perfect, what is it going to be like to be in a relationship with someone who thinks that way about themselves? Right? That kind of relationship is never going to work because the reality is that we're not being real with ourselves and we can't be real in the relationship. For example, with Bonnie, right, is that if I'm convinced that I'm perfect and I have no problems, I'm unlikely to be very loving towards her because I'm so busy being in love with myself that there's no space left. And the other thing that's so important to remember is that even if I somehow convince myself that I have no problems, does that mean I actually have no problems? But clearly I have one to start with, right? Right? And so the good news is when it comes to Bonnie and me is that I have no delusions that I am perfect. I have made tons of mistakes. I have done damage that can never be undone. I've done things that I can't fix. But then when I realize how my bad choices and my actions impact not just me, but the person I'm in a relationship with, and then I realize that Bonnie loves me anyway, and Bonnie cares about me anyway, and she accepts me and forgives me when I've given her many reasons to make that really, really hard to do. As I understand that, it starts to change things for me. As I start to see how she loves me, I start to love her more deeply because of all those things. And it begins to build my love for her, and it builds my trust for her, and it strengthens our relationship when we have that kind of real recognition of what is actually going on. Not walking in delusions, not convincing myself that I am perfect and I am so easy to live with that every woman would want to live with me. Right? But that's a joke, right, to keep us going. Right? It was just so blatant you couldn't even laugh, I guess, what it comes down to, right? But when I recognize the reality of that situation, it changes things, and it actually makes things better. That we are happier and we are healthier and we are better when we recognize that we have things going on in our lives that sometimes makes being with us difficult, and recognizing that we have challenges and we have problems. So as we continue our series, A Most Excellent Adventure, what I'd like to talk about is the perfection paradox. That this idea that if I am convinced that I am perfect, it damages everything in my life. But when I accept that I'm not perfect, my relationships and actually my life gets a lot better. Now remember that throughout this series, what we're doing is that we're actually kind of looking at the first century documents we call the New Testament, and we're trying to look at those in a very real sense, imagining that we're back in the first century, looking at what's going on with first century eyes, not 21st century eyes. And we said to have fun with it, we would actually pretend that we have a time machine and travel back and see what we could see. So today, let's hop into our time machine, and let's travel back to the first half of the first century, very early in the ministry of Jesus, probably like his first year. And as we head back, we arrive, and we find ourselves in kind of an unexpected place. We find ourselves in a home, and there's a dinner going on. Now, because we've been back before, we know what Jesus looks like, so we recognize Jesus, but there are other people here, and they appear to be religious leaders. Because remember that religious leaders wore kind of this very fancy dress. In a time where most people were just fighting to survive, the religious leaders of that time were very fancy and involved clothing, so they're really easy to pick out. And that's kind of what they wanted. So we see Jesus here, and the dinner is underway. There are these various religious leaders there. And as we listen to the conversation, we realize that this is home of one of the religious leaders named Simon. And they're there having dinner together. And as we listen in, the conversation's already going on, and we're not quite clear what's happening at this point. But then we hear Jesus start to tell a parable. Right? A parable is simply a story, a fictional story that has some meaning to it. Right? So he's telling the story to all these religious leaders there. We hear him tell this story that a man loaned money to two people, 500 pieces of silver to one, and 50 pieces to the other. Now, the thing to understand is that what's translated here as pieces of silver is actually a particular coin known as a denarii. It's a silver coin from the first century. And the thing that's important to understand about that coin is that coin was what an average worker earned in one day. So what that means then is that someone has just been lent 500 days' wages. Someone else has been lent 50 days' wages, which is an enormous amount of money for that time. In both cases, they are incredible amounts of money. So Jesus carries on saying that, well, neither of them could repay. But the lender kindly forgave them both, canceling their debts. Then he turns and asks this question: who do you suppose loved the lender more after that? And Simon, this Pharisee here, answers and says, well, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the larger debt. And that's right, Jesus says. Now, to give us context on what's happening in that little story that Jesus tells, what we need to understand is that at that time, that coin, this denarii, represented one day's wages. Do you know what else it represented? About what it cost to survive for a day. Remember that most people lived hand to mouth in the first century. That basically every day you made enough money to live today, to go to work tomorrow, to make money to live another day. Now, what that means then is that whether you owe 50 days' wages or 500 days' wages, there's no way you can pay that money back. Because in order to work 50 days to pay back 50 days' wages, you need to spend 50 days' wages to stay alive. So whether you owe 50 days' wages or 500 days' wages, it doesn't matter. It's like, do you owe $100 million or $1 billion? You know, in the end, it doesn't really matter. I ain't paying either one of them, right? It's that same sort of thing, that it's such a scale of money that they can't really do it. But here's the key thing. Sometimes, when things are a little out of reach, we can convince ourselves that somehow I'll be able to do it, right? Somehow I'll quit drinking tomorrow, right? Somehow I'll quit spending tomorrow, right? Somehow I'll get past whatever that thing is that's in my way tomorrow or later or soon. But then when we reach a point where the number is so big and so large and so heavy, we wake up and we're like, man, I can't do it. I can't do it. There is no way I can do this on my own. And that's the point that Jesus is making here. For the one who owed the 500, there was no convincing themselves that they were ever going to be able to make enough money to pay that back. And so they recognized the scale of the gift that forgiveness is. But for the one who owed 50, even though they had no real chance of paying it back, they could convince themselves that somehow they would get there. So that's Jesus' point as he tells this story. But kind of an interesting question comes up. Why is he telling the story to this group of religious leaders? What's his point in telling that? I mean, it's a nice story, and we can kind of glean a point from it. But how does it apply to the conversation that he's in right now? So it seems like we probably need a little bit more context to understand what brought this conversation on. So let's do this. Let's jump back into our time machine, and let's just go back a little bit earlier in the day. So that same day, let's head back a little earlier, and let's see what kind of led to this conversation and how everything came together. So we jump into our time machine, we head back a little bit earlier in that day, and as we arrive, we're on target. It's earlier in the day, and as we arrive, instead of being in the house, we're kind of now outside in the city. And as we look around, we see a familiar sight, something we've seen before. We see Jesus in the streets teaching people. And as he's teaching people, he's also caring for people. He's showing compassion towards people. He's helping people get past things that they're dealing with. And part of his teaching includes something that he commonly repeated, that God wants to be in a close relationship with you that's about love. But the religious leaders that are of that time, are creating barriers for people. And as Jesus would teach this aspect of things, two things would happen. One, the crowd loved this message, that God really did love them and wanted to be close to them. But the religious leaders did not like this message. Because remember that by the first century, the religious leadership had reached a point of corruption that their entire goal was to advance themselves at anyone's cost. And so they would use their power as religious leaders to effectively hold people down, and in doing that, actually keeping people from God. So as Jesus is telling this, or having this conversation with everyone in the crowd, the man that we saw earlier, Simon, the Pharisee, this religious leader, along the edge of the crowd, walks up to Jesus, and he invites Jesus to dinner. Now, why would Simon, when Jesus is teaching like this, invite him to dinner? And we don't actually know. I mean, it could have been a couple things. One possibility is that he was actually liking some of what Jesus was teaching and wanted to learn more about it. Some Pharisees did do that over time. Another possibility is Simon just wanted Jesus to shut up. And so I'll invite him to dinner and he'll shut up and we won't have to deal with this right now. At this point, we don't actually know what's happening, but we do know that Jesus accepted the dinner invitation. So Jesus heads over to Simon's house, and as he arrives, Simon invites him in and goes sit at the table. Technically, he goes to invite him to recline at the table. And the reason that's kind of important is that in the first century, people didn't sit at tables on chairs like we do now. What people actually did is they actually kind of laid on the floor and they kind of reclined. Like think when you're a kid and you're watching TV sort of thing. Like that's kind of how they sat around the table. And if it was a nicer home, there'd be pillows and so forth. So you'd be kind of propped up on the pillows. The table's right here. You're kind of eating with your hands and your feet kind of point off, kind of out away from the table. And as Jesus comes in, other religious leaders are already reclining at the table. And as we watch this go down, as we watch Simon invite Jesus in, and Jesus go recline at the table, to us it seems normal. It's because in the 21st century, that is quite normal. But it turns out that a bunch of things should have happened that didn't happen. Whenever you invited someone into your home, particularly for a meal, there were certain courtesies that you were supposed to extend to that person. And if it was a respected person, and Jesus was largely a respected teacher, not everyone liked him, but he was a respected teacher. If someone was respected, you would do even additional things. And as it happens, none of these things happened. And some of these are really basic things. For example, it's in the first century. What do you think the common mode of transportation is? Your feet, right? Walking, right? You walk everywhere you go. And what kind of footwear do you wear? Sandals. So you're walking a lot in sandals in a desert climate. Dirty, dirty feet. Very dirty feet. So a common courtesy, and maybe just for a little cleanliness, like when you ask someone to take their shoes off when they come in your house, you would extend someone a basin to wash their feet. Common courtesy, you would do that for most people. But Simon doesn't do that. Other common things that you would do is that it always sounds funny to us, but they would often offer you olive oil for your hair. It was kind of a way of just kind of neatening up, cleaning up, feeling a little cooler with something on your head. Simon didn't offer that. And then if someone respected was coming into your home, you would actually greet them with a kiss on the cheek as a sign of respect and welcome into your home. Simon didn't do any of these things. He simply directed Jesus to the table. So what happens now is that Simon is sending a whole bunch of messaging about how he feels about Jesus without ever saying a word. And all this is going on. And what it means is that, at a minimum, Simon is being rude. And Simon would have been a person of means. The religious leadership was a person of means at that time. And also, he would have been very socially adept. He would know what proper treatment of a guest is. So again, at a minimum, he's being rude, but there's also a very strong possibility he was trying to send Jesus a message. You know, those uneducated people in the street, yeah, they buy into what you're selling. I'm not buying it. And he's trying to send that message to Jesus, trying to put Jesus in his place, that you think you're somebody, but I don't think you're somebody. I'm much better than you are. That's kind of the hidden messaging that's going through everything that happens here. Now, as Jesus enters and they're all reclining around the table, something very strange happens. A woman just walks through the front door. Now, a person walking into our homes today, of course, would be quite odd. But at that time, it would be really, really odd, because a woman would never go into another home alone of a man that wasn't family, someone she was related to. And as she comes in, everyone at the table gets a little bit uncomfortable. And we start to hear murmurings and rumblings as she walks in. And you start hearing words like immoral, sinful. And they're all judging her, and all she did was walk through the door. Now, that tells us that they are at least aware of who she is. But we don't really know what relationship they have, if any. But what we do know is that Simon, the guy who owns the home, and none of the other religious leaders are happy to see this woman. And then she begins to do something that is incredibly awkward. She actually kneels down at the feet of Jesus, tears pouring from her eyes. Begins to wash and dry his feet. And then she begins to pull out a very expensive perfumed lotion, something you can't imagine how she could possibly afford. Begins to rub it on his feet. And keep in mind what we learned about extending courtesies to people. Right? Simon was expected to allow Jesus to wash his feet, greet him tenderly, offer him oil for his hair. She has done all those things multiplied for him now. And she's doing it for him. And she's showing that she has tremendous respect for him, tremendous love for him, sees him as someone incredibly special. And when all this goes down, Simon, disgusted by what's happening, mumbles to himself. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus, this is Simon, saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. She is a sinner. And keep in mind, that word sinner, man, that could be a whole gambit of things, right? That could simply mean that there were a few religious things that she didn't do that they thought were important, all the way up to things that may have been much more serious. We don't really know. But we know what these religious leaders think of her. And so again, as we talked about last week, that so often the leadership would look at people as rules or as broken rules. Well, in this case, they see her as someone who's breaking the rules, right? Someone for whom they have no compassion. They have no concern. They simply look down on her. And not only do they look down on her, but they then in turn look down on Jesus for not looking down on her. Now, we're told that Jesus was aware of what Simon said to himself. Whether he ever heard him, whatever it was, but Jesus is aware. And when this happens, when Simon refers to her as a sinner and Jesus should know better, that's when Jesus tells this parable. In other words, he doesn't respond to what Simon says. He just goes right into the, hey, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you a story. And he talks about the person owing 500 days' wages versus 50 days' wages. And then Jesus asked that question at the end. The one who's forgiven 50, the one who's forgiven a little, or the one who's forgiven a lot? Who loved the forgiver more? And remember, the one for whom he canceled the larger debt. And then from there, Jesus expounds on exactly what's going on. And he actually points out that all the things that Simon should have done to greet a guest, and he didn't do. And then he points out what they call a sinful woman is now doing to honor and respect Jesus and show her love for Jesus, show her trust for Jesus, and show her respect for Jesus. And the point that Jesus is driving home with his story is that, you know what? This woman sees who I am because her burdens are crushing her. The things in her past, in her life, and her actions that she cannot undo are crushing her. And she realizes that there is no way that she can put all this right by herself. And she recognizes that Jesus is offering to free her from her burdens, that Jesus offers a path to freedom. And she sees that. And she actually knows that her faith in Jesus can show her to a better life, can show her forward. And then Jesus says to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Because she's like the one who owed 500 days' wages, she had no delusions that she could fix her life all by herself. She had no delusions that a little tweak here, a little tweak there was going to make everything better. She recognized that she needed earth-shattering power. She needed God's power as extended through Jesus to find freedom in her life. Find freedom and find forgiveness. But Simon, the religious leader, is like the one who owed 50. You know, maybe Simon had made fewer mistakes than this woman did. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We don't really know all of his past. But it doesn't matter whether he had actually made more mistakes or less mistakes than this woman. He sees himself as not needing any help. He sees himself as having been perfect, or at least perfect enough to not need that sort of thing. And so Simon has convinced himself that he can fix it all by himself, and he doesn't need any help from God or from Jesus to do better. And what that means is that Simon is going to be stuck. Simon is not going to change. Simon is not going to move forward. The woman moves forward in freedom, with renewal, and a start into a new life. Simon remains stuck in his attitude about himself and about everyone else. So where does that leave each of us? What burden are each of us carrying? What is something in each of our lives that we can't break free of? What's that thing that just dogs you all the time, and that if you sit when it's quiet and it comes to mind and you can't break free of it? What is that thing for each of us? And let's not be like the one who owed 50 and convince ourselves that we can get free all by ourselves. Let's instead embrace the fact that there is true freedom available through Jesus, that there is a path forward. And he's not asking us to do some huge set of things. He's simply asking us to have faith that if we want to move forward, if we want to be free, he is offering us that path to freedom. So as we wrap up today, I want to just encourage each of us to just take some time and think about it. We all know what that thing is. When I said, what's that thing that's dogging you, we all have something come to mind. Take some time to just think about that and ask Jesus just to move into this and show you a way forward to break free of it. It will change everything. It will change your life. It will change your relationships. And as a church, we do this. It allows us to change this little piece of the world where God has placed us.